Hi, my name is Helen Ward, and I'm the president of Kids First Parent Association of Canada. I'd like to begin the first of a four-part presentation on parent-child rights and education in Canada with suggestions for what to do when education personnel violate parent-child rights. Let's get started. Screen share here. Okay. So we're going to talk about parent-child rights in education in Canada with suggestions for legal action when education personnel violate parent-child rights. And I'm with Kids First Parent Association of Canada. We're at kidsfirstcanada.org. We're established in 1987. You can become a member, that'd be great, and donate. So this is going to be a four-part presentation. The first part, which this is about what is happening, the big picture. Next part is what is happening in schools. Third part, suggestions for how to make a complaint and take legal action. And the fourth and last part, what rights do parents and children have? So we are part one, what is happening, the big picture. We're going to talk about discrimination versus parents, defamilialization, and a power imbalance. So we see systemic government discrimination against parents, against parental rights and duties, against the parent-child relationship, and against children's well-being. We see the discrimination in laws and policies related to education, such as compulsory school attendance, which started in 1872 in BC, residential schools, and in childcare policies, in child protection services, more correctly called family policing services. We see it in medical treatment, for example, in the Infants Act and the concept of mature minors, so-called mature minors. We see it in the regulation or lack of regulation in child harming products and advertising to children. We see it in data collection, privacy violation, and violations of parental consent. So this is not just random. There's an ideology. It's called defamilialization. Defamilialization. Can you even pronounce that? It's an unmarketable ideology. So what is this? The post-war world was a familialist world. Policies were made to support the family's responsibilities to care for each other. But now we're moving into, or we have moved into, a post-familialist and post-maternalist policy framework. There's something called the reconciliation agenda. This reconciliation agenda is to reconcile the employment and family responsibilities of men and women. That's a mouthful, but you've probably heard of work-life balance and work-family balance. That's what that actually means. And it's part of a neoliberalism, neoconservative, or called a neocolonialism kind of agenda. In it, we see an ideological convergence, a combining of what I would call the corporate right, the profit-making crowd, and the narrow band of the left that's an anti-family wing of the left and the labor left. Oh, also, this also is combines the labor left. It's a top-down, technocratic kind of agenda. It's led by international organizations such as the OECD, the RAND Corporation, the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Economic Forum. And in this policy agenda, we see that family functions, family care and education functions are being colonized by the government and transferred from the family to GDP sector jobs and government programs. So where we once had direct funding support to families to help families with their care responsibilities, especially raising children, we see these funds are being transferred away from direct funding to families to services provided by government, by businesses, and by NGOs, or nonprofit societies and charities. And this would include churches, for example, churches providing daycare. We see that families are being financially punished for caring for their own members. it's there's more financial help when you put your loved one into an institutional care setting than when you look after them yourself. So government policy coerces families to use funded non-family options. So you also have less control of these options. Families are not seen as families with ends in themselves, but as GDP sector clients, as consumers, and as labor supply, and as data sources to be mined for research purposes. And so children, parents, elders, disabled folks become fodder for services, for income and profit. So another aspect of defamilialization is what's called shared responsibility. We're ending the family-friendly familialist policies of the post-war welfare state and moving to, and this is according to a document called An Integrated Approach to Early Childhood Education and Care. It was published by UNESCO and the OECD. So we're moving to a new order, a paradigm shift to shared responsibility between the state and parents for child rearing. And parents are to be partners with the state. And in this partnership, we are to avoid the primacy of the family. We're moving towards professionalization of care. You amateurs, moms, dads, siblings, friends, you are not up to snuff. You are not regulated. You are not licensed. And what this vision is something, they want to create something called the new child, the public child. And in this agenda, we see a rejection of the science of child development and a rejection of attachment theory. This would be like having the engineers who build your bridges reject the theory of gravity. We have the social engineers engaging in a social mega project, and they reject the basic science underpinning child development. And a big part of this is to get more women in spending more time in paid work. And our own UBC's Paul Kershaw speaks of this as the just commodification of women. For me, the word commodification of women, I find that very hard to swallow, but he sees this as a just commodification of women. And part of the neoliberal agenda is this is the invention of a concept where citizens have an obligation, just as if we have a kind of an obligation to vote. Well, now we have a new obligation, according to the neo-libcons, to all have full-time jobs. This obligation, so that to increase the labor supply. They want us to believe that that's an obligation as opposed to something that you would do for your own personal reasons. And in this obligation, Mr. Kershaw says that we should use the coercive powers of the state to alter citizenry decisions. So the coercive powers of the state are, it's okay to use those to shape our decisions rather than just let people make up their minds on themselves, on their own, and do as they see fit. And the ideal citizen is the single mother who's dependent on her employment income and or the government for her sustenance without help from a family member or a spouse. I'm a single mother. I don't recommend this as an ideal citizenry type. And when we used to have women's liberation and women's equality, now we have something called gender equity. That's gender equity is measured by the female labor supply. There's more females in the labor supply, then we have more gender equity. It doesn't matter what women want, how we're doing, how we're feeling, how our health is, how our lifespan is, or anything. It's just about increasing the labor supply. When you increase the labor supply, you decrease wages and you increase profits, which is why the corporate right is all about this agenda. So in the defamilialization agenda, we see an erosion of parental rights and parental consent. we've had compulsory school attendance laws for just over 150 years in BC, and you can't opt out of school. There's no court authorization needed for the state to remove children under the so-called child protection laws. And this can all happen. The state can basically take over a family without parental consent. If you're not sure if that's true, just ask people who faced it. So and then in child protection laws, we see that parents will consent to things, but it's not real consent because their consent is coerced, and your rights as a parent can be stripped away without any authorization by a judge. And there's this other concept called mature minor consent, so-called mature minor consent. And in BC, we have the Infants Act. That's the law that created this concept out of the imaginations of people, so that so-called healthcare providers can decide that your child is capable of providing consent or declining any kind of healthcare treatment without the parent's consent. We also have something called passive consent, or also called negative opt-out, when schools are conducting social science research without meaningful consent from parents. This happens every year in BC and in some other provinces too. Social science research conducted on our children and your family and yourself without your written consent, without your informed consent, with passive consent. And we have, so it's a data mining of children and their parents through the schools without meaningful consent. So another aspect of defamilialization is the financial, social, and police coercion of parents. So when the government transfers funding for children to services and away from families, then it's a way to financially coerce families to use those services and not to provide the services themselves, or to control how that service is provided. And there's obviously a financial coercion to enroll your children in state schools because that is the cheapest option, and you're paying for your taxes anyway. We had welfare reform in the 1990s. Very few people don't know about this, but in the 1990s, under the neoliberal conservative agenda, welfare reform took away billions of dollars that went directly to poor parents, basically single mothers and their children usually, and transferred that funding to daycare for the kids and workfare jobs for the moms. So parents in the past had been able to stay on welfare until the youngest child was 18 in BC, and that was lowered until now. When your youngest child is 2, you are no longer eligible for welfare, and in most places it's when the child is age 1. So billions of dollars were taken from mothers and children, parents, families, and transferred to corporations and so-called nonprofit societies that provide workfare programs and wage subsidized jobs for the moms. So it's a jobs for moms workfare subsidy. It's clearly a form of corporate welfare because the businesses are getting money from the government. And then of course we have most families have some degree of fear of child protection services, at the family policing services, because if you get a call from a social worker, it will dramatically upset your family life. Another aspect of defamilialization is the government's routine misinforming and lying to parents about our rights and our children's rights, about basic things like breastfeeding, about daycare. They'll say that licensed daycare is high quality and provides the best start in life, neither of which is true. Now we have schools are hiding information from parents, and we also have products marketed to children that harm children, and we're not informed about that, or we're misinformed about it. For example, all the digital devices and the screens kids are given and they're supposed to use in schools and that are sold to children with and no warnings on them or anything. We see in defamilialization a normalizing of prejudice versus parents. I guess it was back in 2006, and so but it still continues. Where one of the liberal communication staff spoke about we couldn't give funding to parents because they would spend it on beer and popcorn. So this just it's just a discriminatory statement. There's a presumption without any evidence that parents are abusive. You'll see that schools will say, oh, we can't tell the parents because they might be abusive. Well, that's called a violation of your right to innocence, being innocent before proven guilty. But this is routine. And we have a presumption in the law, despite a clear, tragic historical record that state-controlled care and education of children is safer and better. The child protection laws don't seem to take into account the fact that child protection services have destroyed the lives of many children and in a criminal way. So to assume that their care is neutral, benign, or better there's no evidence for that. Contradicts the evidence. And there's no government recognition and appreciation for parents as the frontline workers, the first responders, the child care workers, and as productive citizens. It's like you are, if you're a parent, a frontline worker. You are a first responder. You are a child care worker. You are a productive citizen. And in defamilialization, we also see there's a sacrificing of child well-being for money for adults. Requiring parents them on their own to protect children from harms, like the harms that are in advertising, the harms of traffic, the harms that are out there. It's parents' responsibility. They can choose not to watch TV or not to look at those things or something like that, as if there's no social role for the government to regulate harms to children. There used to be laws regulating advertising targeting children. Those have all ended. As I said before, child policy makers reject attachment theory and science. They reject peer-reviewed research. They reject developmental science and attachment theory. So the people who are designing policies for children and for families don't accept the basic science and basic attachment theory. They suppress information about negative outcomes for children in daycare and all-day kindergarten. They're willing to sacrifice our children's well-being. The laws in daycare allow far too many children per staff. In Quebec, for example, it's one staff for up to 5 infants. Picture that. We see pharmaceutical products being overprescribed for children. It's like if you want to make money, invest in all the Ritalin type products for children now. There's a promotion of infant formula in hospitals, even though this is actually illegal. And we see no regulation of products that harm children, like the digital devices, and schools have embraced so-called remote screen-based schooling as if that is a wise idea, when in fact it's harmful to children and it's very suboptimal for their learning. So this comes out of this defamilialization agenda, comes out of a historical and escalating power imbalance between parents and the state. If we compare the state with parents, you see that with the state situation, no one is individually legally liable for what happens to children. But parents, we have unique legal obligations and liability for our children. We saw in the mid-1800s, we saw residential schools in Canada, and we also saw laws for compulsory school attendance. In the past, that did not exist. This was something that the state invented. And those things could happen back then because there was no human rights protection for Indigenous families or for children or for parents. So they just implemented a policy that wholesale forced a certain behavior, attending school or attending residential school, on thousands and thousands and thousands of people, the whole population. We see that the state has gradually expanded its role over the centuries. and it's encroaching increasingly on the family. But parents, we're immortal. We die and we don't expand over time, whereas the state can just keep expanding. The state is about systems, but we are individuals. We see that the state groups are very well organized to assert and advance their interests, but parents are not organized to assert and advance our interests. And there's a legal clash. Funding for legal costs for the state comes from taxpayers, that we fund legal action against parents, and also professional groups and advocacy groups, unions and all that associated with government agencies. They fund legal action, but parents don't have public funding for their legal costs for these defend their rights. The state has unlimited time, energy, and money to fight parents, and parents have very little time, money, or energy, or knowledge to fight the state. Systems don't age, children get older, and the issues that are of concern to a family might become irrelevant because the child has aged out of that issue. And nowadays in BC, I'm not sure so much sure about other provinces, but schools don't even need local students as much because we have fee-paying international students that can fill in when BC students choose to go to independent schools or to homeschool. Then the school population would go down, but it doesn't have to go down because we put in these fee-paying international students. An international student pays $14,000 a pop, and we also have new laws that allow the children of work study visa holders to attend our schools for free. So the student population is still keeping up in the schools, even though more and more people are going to independent schools and homeschooling options. So we leave the state schools, but voting with our feet doesn't even count because they just fill in with others. And we have the government has lots of lawyers, and all the unions that work for the government, they all have lots of lawyers, and very few lawyers on the parent side are expert in parental rights. And when there is a clash and it does go to court, the state might win in the lower court thing, and parents have only rarely appealed the bad judgments that have happened to higher courts. So there's very little legal precedent, there's very little legal expertise in this area of parent-child rights and the state. There's the power balance. Okay. So it's good to know your history because it does repeat sometimes. Now, this is a picture of Egerton Ryerson, devout Christian minister. And in the 1800s, this devout Christian believers like Mr. Ryerson set up the system of compulsory attendance in tax-funded state-run schools, and he also set up the residential school system. So it was devout Christian believers that set up and especially Mr. Ryerson, set up the state-run school system and the residential school system. And they did that before there was any human rights laws. Think about that. So this is the end of the first part of this presentation. I hope you'll check out part 2, 3, and 4. Thank you for listening.